One of the things I've realized from responding to cloud security incidents is that identity really is the front door to the whole business. Microsoft 365, Azure, they hold so much value to attackers. And if your governance of Entra isn't nailed, that door is going to be creaky and full of holes. Matt Levy, MVP, is going to join me for this one, and we're going to unpack something called Entra ID Governance. We're going to talk about sources of authority and provisioning mistakes. And he's generally going to school me and you in what Entra ID Governance is all about. So let's get into it. Okay, Matt, so I keep hearing about this thing called source of authority, or SOA, when people talk about Entra and identity in general. What's the deal there? What do IT pros have to know about that in the context of Entra?
Well, so there's a couple of things, I suppose. If you are using Active Directory, domain services on-premises Active Directory, and you're synchronizing your identity to Entra, the source of authority up until this point is Active Directory. So any changes that you need to make to an identity, adding identities to groups or changes to attributes need to be made on premises on that Active Directory and then synchronized. The other thing about source of authority is it's not always Active Directory in enterprises. Active Directory might be a part of it, and so could Entra, but the actual source of authority is typically an HR database or an HR system, a human capital system. So to me, from an Entra perspective or an identity perspective, that source of authority is actually HR.
And so that kind of leads me to a discussion you and I had earlier, and that is that this idea that maybe if you're in a smaller business, you immediately go in your way, provision that user in Entra ID or in AD, something like that. But I guess for organizations of any great scale, really the first point of provision is going to be the HR system. And so how does
Correct.
how does that spill over into something like Entra? What joins those dots?
So I guess you mentioned a small company, a small organization manually going and creating identities directly in Entra, and actually I've seen that in larger organizations as well. And what they do is they build custom scripts to maybe do a little bit of automation, but there's still a lot of room for error. Writing scripts or running exports and imports and staging databases and things like that. There's room for mistakes to be made and things not going according to plan. But also it doesn't immediately give somebody the access that they require from day one. And I'm thinking of an onboarding situation for a new starter. Microsoft referred to it as their birthright access. So somebody starting at a company on the first day needs to have a certain level of access in order to, join and start the induction process or the onboarding process. So that often doesn't happen automatically when there's these scripts, because what happens is the account just gets created, or if somebody's doing it manually, an account gets created, but something gets forgotten. Oh, I need to grant that person access to a SharePoint site so that they can access the team or whatever the case may be.
Right. And it's a great point, because you kind of called out there that this isn't a problem that only affects small companies, right? And it's even a lot of large companies, you get in there and you find out all this stuff is just held together with duct tape and PowerShell scripts. And so Entra ID Governance, that's the new add-on SKU, part of Entra Suite. And part of that you get with P2, part of it's an add-on license, right? So
That's right.
what are the demarcation lines there?
So you do get some of the identity governance capabilities in Entra ID P2. It's a limited set of functionality. The Entra Suite adds on the identity governance SKU, which then creates more advanced joiners, movers, leavers, workflows that you can leverage. And it also gives you the ability to do custom workflows, attaching a custom logic app or script Azure function, for example.
Gotcha. And is that add-on SKU what I really need to leverage some of the stuff you mentioned, which would be escaping manual work / PowerShell and having that kind of HR app, human capital app, source of authority to Entra provisioning that's kind of unlocked at that level of license?
So actually, no. So to be fair, the provisioning of identities into Entra or into Active Directory from another source of authority doesn't require that additional license, but to leverage the additional workflows, lifecycle workflows, the joiners, mover, leaver workflows, and the access packages and entitlements, access reviews and those kinds of things, they all require their identity governance license. So you can go ahead and provision users into your identity provider, your IDP, but you can't really do much with them if you don't have that SKU.
Right, gotcha. So it makes the after creation, after the birth process, that the ongoing management of it a lot easier. And so I know that you get templates and things like out the box to start. I guess you don't have to start from scratch, right? It's like a lot of stuff in Entra. You can click a few buttons and get stuff out the box. So what does that look like?
Within identity governance lifecycle workflows, Microsoft have provided a couple of sort of pre-built templates that you can use. And then they've given them categories, joiner, mover, and leaver categories. And I'll just show you some of the joiner or one or two of the joiner templates, because that's typically what we're talking about, the onboarding process. So this onboard pre-hire employee template will, I'm just going to expand the details of it, will happen based on a time-based trigger. So essentially 7 days before the employee starts, the employee hire date. And so I'm highlighting this because that's quite an important attribute. And what it will do is it'll create the user, add it to a marketing department, but it will also generate a TAP, a temporary access pass, and send an email to the manager so that the manager is aware that the account has been created and this is the TAP. Now, fast forward 7 days or, to the date that person is starting, the hire date, we can trigger the onboarding workflow. And this is, again, a built-in one that happens 0 days of employee hire date. So it happens the day, and that will enable the account, which means that previously the account was created but in a disabled state. So from a security perspective, and send a welcome email, welcome to the team, etc., and add the user to various teams in Microsoft Teams or groups so that they can have access to the onboarding or the induction material, etc. Again, that uses that employee hire date attribute, which is quite important.
Well, yeah, because that was one of the things I was going to ask you, actually, because I'm thinking of when I'm in Entra and I'm creating users and I'm looking at properties and I'm not seeing employee hire date. So where does that get spun out of?
Yeah. So employee hire date is an attribute that you can set in Entra, but you have to do it with graph. So it's not something that you can see in the UI very easily. There's also a last, essentially the last day of employment,
right,
and a time that goes with that. So it's not just the date, there's a time as well. So it could be 5 p.m. on the 31st of whatever month. And that is also a hidden attribute. Once that value is set, however, you can see it in the UI, you can see it in the portal, but only the employee hire date. The leaver date time is still hidden from the UI. You wouldn't be able to see it, but you can utilize it in workflows.
Gotcha. Any idea why they designed the decision to hide that? Is that like a privacy thing, or hey, I don't want to know if someone's getting... So don't want to know if someone's getting
canned. I imagine that's why it's hidden. Yeah, I don't know for sure.
Okay. And so I guess, you see it all the time where, people will have like a manual process and it falls through because the person that provisions the account is off sick or they get inundated with other work and it just doesn't happen. I guess this just makes it a bit safer. And dare I say almost safer from a cybersecurity perspective, because you're You're predefining what will be the allowable activity for the user before they start and then when they start.
Correct. Yes,
Right.
exactly. As you saw, one of the templates there was it will create the account, but it won't create it enabled. So, once the account is created, the date of the employee starting has to happen before it's actually enabled. So there's no risk of the account being, compromised or used beforehand, or
And
credentials being shared.
and so the provisioning of these accounts then from something like an HR app, is there like a
Mm.
preset list of these are the supported apps, or is it wide open? Like what does that look like?
So so a bit of both. Microsoft have obviously partnered with various cloud-based HR systems like Workday and SailPoint and others, so that so you can go and get an enterprise app, provision it into Entra for that application, and it's pre-configured. Then there are also custom APIs that you can create. So essentially, any system that you use from an HR source can be integrated into Entra. There are some of those big players, Bamboo being another one, and there's a couple of names out there. Can't remember them all. But if you've got a bespoke system, or you've got a system that's not, one of the big players, you can still integrate it using the API inbound provisioning.
So if I do a little bit of manual hokey pokey, I can ultimately get anything going on there.
Yeah, yeah. And so actually, what I've done, and this is, it seems like it's a little bit rudimentary, but as a proof of concept, you can have a CSV file that you populate. And so I'm just show you an example of a very small CSV file, but it's got some attributes. I've got the first name, the last name, full name, bunch of detail, and hire date, right? Which is that important attribute that we want to be able to use those lifecycle workflows, and other attributes that are important to the business. And through the API-based inbound provisioning, I can parse this CSV file and create a SCIM, that's a system for cross-domain identity management payload, that then gets passed to the API. And the API then consumes that payload and provisions the users. And just out of interest, they get provisioned in my environment directly into Active Directory, into a specified OU, and they get provisioned with whatever attributes I want to be applied to that user. And I can show you some of the attribute mappings that happen. But the important thing is we've mapped the date, the employee hire date, to the MSDS Cloud Extension Attribute 1 on premises in Active Directory. And then through the Entra Connect sync that happens, that gets synchronized to Entra ID.
Right. That's very cool. And I guess I want to make sure I fully understand that. So the provisioning is facilitated from the HR app or the CSV. And in your case, if you're a hybrid org, you can actually provision it to AD, which then syncs it to the cloud. And that provisioning in AD is kind of paradoxically done by Entra. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
That's right.
Oh, okay, right. So you don't have to completely upend your architecture, I guess, is what I'm getting at here, right? Because loads of folks will still be using AD as the source of authority.
Yeah. So I want to show you a diagram. So obviously there's a couple of options, and I mentioned that you might have a system that Microsoft recognizes, or you've got your CSV or a database, or something that's bespoke, right? And you can then, using the API inbound provisioning system, provision to either or both on-premises Active Directory and Entra ID. So you've got your hybrid use case. So you might have users that need to be hybrid users because they need to have access to on-premises resources. And so they have to be provisioned in Active Directory, but also in Entra, so then they get synchronized. But you could have your cloud-only users, and you just have different rules that apply to say which target they get provisioned into.
That's gnarly. That's cool. So as an example, let me play out a scenario with you. Because I guess in my head I'm thinking, well, like, just how extensible is this? So let's say, as an example, I'm hiring a new person to join the IT team, and their business as usual productivity account, we're going to provision that on-prem, but we're also going to have a separate standalone admin account that is going to be a cloud-only account.
Yep.
That kind of degree of customization and JML process achievable?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Cool.
you could create some attribute mappings, and maybe I can show you the attribute mappings table that I have just for my POC. But what you can do is through the extension schema, you can join attributes that you get from your CSV. So you have one CSV, one user in there, new starter, first name Bob, second last name Jones, right? But you want to provision two separate accounts. You could use the schema to create a normal on-premises user account, Bob Jones, but you could then append ADM or prepend ADM to the first name, and then you have ADM underscore Bob Jones as a second account that gets provisioned directly to cloud, kind of thing.
That is so cool. Okay. I got a lot of playing to do with this, kind of this. And so maybe like I'll be honest, one of the things that I always try and figure out is, before I dive into something like a new toy, what are the gotchas, right? What are the things that might trip me up? And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, great, I'll be able to do this. But then maybe I can't do it. Or maybe I just get in there gung-ho and I start making mistakes that will come back to bite me. So what are the top things that IT pros need to know before they get started playing with Entra ID Governance?
So the main thing that I consider a gotcha is to get started playing with the lifecycle workflows. You need some of those date attributes populated. So you might be creating some test accounts, or you might actually be wanting to do this and create accounts for your organization, to prove the concept. And you create those accounts directly into Entra to then go and assign these workflows to. You won't have been able to populate those dates unless you go through Graph and populate them manually one by one. So you want to have that flow through from the API. So what Microsoft do is they have some documentation around the different scenarios that you can choose. And I think I was sort of alluding to, there's a number of different scenarios, but my POC was in my environment was a CSV file. But now that CSV file, first of all, needs to be somewhere that the Logic app can go and grab it. So there's a couple of things. There's a file share in Azure that I can SFTP the CSV file up to on a weekly basis, monthly basis, whatever the case may be. And then the function, there's an Azure function which converts CSV to JSON, because the schema needs to be in a JSON payload, converts that JSON payload to a bulk request. So this is all done in the Logic app, and then it sends it to the API provisioning endpoint, which I have in my Entra tenant. So the joiner mover workflow, joiner mover lever workflows are all on the far right hand side of this diagram. And so you wouldn't be able to take advantage of those workflows properly unless you've done some of the stuff on the left.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So I don't want to say it's like the thing that comes to mind is, like, back when I used to do ERP systems, you had this whole concept of junk in, junk out, right? So if these things aren't accurate and proper, frankly, that might come back to bite the end user experience, right? If that start date is incorrect, user shows up, all of a sudden that whole process ain't going to go smoothly. So that's a really good point.
And that's why I mentioned I mentioned the time being an important attribute on the lever date, because you don't want to cut the user's access off at 8 a.m. or the default is midnight. So midnight on the last day, the user's access could be revoked, but that's not what you want. You actually want a time, 5 p.m. So there's another gotcha.
That was actually going to be one of my next questions. It was like, how accurate can you be with this? But like, so for example, in like it would respect time zones and things like that, because obviously Entra is a cloud service that applies across the whole world.
That's right. Yeah. So I stand to be corrected, but I think it sets it at UTC, right? The time in the API. So you need to just, think about that. Although, having said that, I think it respects the region of the user. So if the user is, it's got a usage location set, I think it uses that time zone. But I stand to be corrected on that point.
Makes sense. And I'll tell you what, one of the things that caught my eye actually when you were in the template page earlier on was, I want to say it was something like, where was it? Real-time employee termination. That's an interesting one, because obviously from I guess like a kind of security point of view, we want to make sure if someone is terminated from an organization, you probably want them to lose access immediately. But in the context of Entra, it varies. There's a lot going on, but you get things like tokens that may allow access for up to an hour, and Windows won't exactly lock them out immediately if it's Entra joined and stuff like that. So is this trying to solve that problem?
So yes, I believe it is. I haven't actually tested it myself, but I believe it is the big red button. And that's why it's an on-demand workflow, where you can go and run this workflow and disable the user, remove the user from groups. And I believe it revokes the tokens as well. So
very cool. And so that's an interesting point, actually. So the trigger type, you can schedule these based on attributes, or you can have on-demand ones where it's like, hey, this is not. So the steps can be automated, but invoking it, that's a hit the button, get the response type deal.
Yeah.
Very cool. And I guess if you wanted to take it further, and I'm thinking kind of art of the possible here, you could like have it. Could it like invoke scripts and API calls and stuff like that to customize your big red button?
Absolutely. Yeah. So cool. Send an ITSM ticket or some kind of notification or so that's where the Entra ID Governance SKU comes in, because you can have custom logic apps apply. So you have to have created the custom logic app beforehand, and then generate a webhook, and you can then create custom. I think if we let's say if we select this, I will just step through it. Can't actually recall where, but there's a way to call a custom logic app that would do more advanced stuff.
Gotcha. Very cool. Very cool. Because I mean, I love that you get these templates out the box, but like I think of things like conditional access, and you always want to push that a little bit further as you get more mature. And the idea of being able to invoke your own scripts is really kind of, that's really quite appealing. And so I'll tell you what, one final thought that maybe comes to mind is the advantages of the ID governance lifecycle. They're quite apparent, but I mean, I'm going to revert to the Scottish stereotype of being cheap and say, hey, that's an additional cost, right, to the business. And sure, you get into the stage of, hey, there's balances between, you might save some time for the cost of that additional license. But I'm interested, when you talk to customers, what's that swing point at which they say, we were okay with E5, oh, wait a second, now we're going to swing over and make that investment in ID governance? What's the ultimate deciding factor there?
So I've spoken to customers that are on both ends of the scale. And lately, a lot of customers have said that the stuff that they do today is not working properly. The manual stuff or the integration with whatever existing system that they have. And so there's a lot of pain that this would remove. So there's value in that. And it's difficult to put a price to that pain and say it's worth my while. But on the other hand, I've spoken to customers who are like, sorry, not interested. There's a cost associated, and we've got this one guy who's written this mammoth PowerShell script that does everything. It's amazing, and if we just need any changes, we get him to edit the PowerShell script. And I say to that, there's a big risk there. There's a key man dependency there, and he's the only guy who knows how to maintain that PowerShell script. If something happens to him or the script, then what? And if they need to change some system, maybe they're very heavily on premises as an organization, but they want to move to cloud, and so maybe there's more cloud software as a service uptake, and they want to be able to provision. There's going to be a lot of change that has to happen. So there's arguments for both, I suppose, but my feeling is, do you want to have that risk? Do you want to own that risk?
It's a great point. But when you're dealing with that kind of scale that a lot of companies are, you're paying for the safety, right? The safety of the guaranteed processes, the SLAs, the Microsoft support, all that stuff that's kind of away in the background, as opposed to a sysadmin with a PowerShell script. Cool. I get it. Well, listen, Matt, that's been really, really informative. Any parting words of advice for folks that are wanting to get started in this?
So there is a POC guidance from Microsoft for identity governance, and have a read through it, have a look at what your scenario might be, and pick one of the scenarios. One of the diagrams I showed was some of the scenarios. Pick one of those scenarios and test it out. Test that you can provision either to Entra directly or on premises, and then flow that identity to Entra, so that you can then leverage those lifecycle workflows.
Awesome. Cool. Good stuff. All right. Well, Matt, I'll get you back on the channel very, very soon. We'll talk more about identity security. Until then, see you later.
Thank you.